death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BC. He is known as the last great Assyrian king. A number of formerly subjugated kingdoms, including Babylonia, Media, and Judah, declared their independence. So once Assyria had been destroyed, gone down in power, the other kingdoms declared their independence. For example, Babylonia was there, Judah was there, Media, all declare its independence. Efforts by the sons and successors of Ashurbanipal, for example, Ashur-etililani and Sinsar-iskun, to stem the tide of rebellion and halt the disintegration of the empire, proved to be futile, right? So Assyrian effort has been failed. Ashur fell to Medes and their king Cyaxares, and in 612 BC, and Nineveh, and for all practical purposes, Assyria fell into coalition of Medes and Babylonians headed by Nabopolassar in 625 BC. So what happened? Nineveh was the capital, Assyria fell, and capital was fell, and it came under this coalition of Medes and Babylonians. A remnant was able to escape and regroup in Haran under the leadership of Assur Uballit II in 612 BC. That the time period is given there, but was forced to flee to Carchemish in 610 BC in the face of relentless Babylonian offensive. So Babylon is taking power in hand and attacking Assyria, and they were running now. It was here that the remaining element of the once invincible Assyrian army, bolstered by its ally, Egypt under Necho II. Egypt was there, Necho was ruling the pharaoh, made its final stand in 605 BC. After a fierce battle, the Assyrians were finally crushed by the superior forces of Babylon. So you have, after Nabopolassar, you have the second king has come, right, led by Nebuchadnezzar, and Necho and his army forced to retreat. So Babylon started to attack, and Babylon is coming into power right here. What happens in Judah? In the last half of the 17th century, southern kingdom, that is Judah, under the Josiah's leadership, enjoyed something of a brief resurgence of worship of Yahweh, right? A brief resurgence. Following the assassination of his father, Ammon, Josiah ascended to the throne at a tender age of 8. Age of 8, he came to power, 632 BC. At the age of 16, Josiah's heart was turned to the Lord. And 4 years after that, in 628 BC, he began a series of religious reforms to purge the southern kingdom of idolatry and to reestablish the worship of Yahweh. Now, Josiah is bringing the reform in Judah. He was aided in this endeavor when in 622 BC, right, Hilkiah the high priest aided him and discovered a book of law while repairing the temple presence. So they also found book of the law in the temple, which was maybe kind of seen as a sign of God's work. However, Josiah's reform, although thoroughgoing, were short-lived and served only to forestall the inevitable judgment that God had promised to bring against Judah, that is southern kingdom, because of its legacy of rebellion and covenant unfaithfulness. What happened in 609? Josiah himself met an untimely death when he attempted to prevent Necho from coming to the aid of the beleaguered Assyrian forces at Carchemish. Although being warned by God not to interfere, Josiah engaged, rebelled, did not obey God, and he was died in a battle, fatally wounded, died shortly. So that's what happened to Josiah. So this is what a brief history during this time. Date is given there, you can look into that. Yeah, so maybe a conclusion was that taken at face value, the historical books indicate that Josiah's reform, although short-lived, was nevertheless successful in restoring the worship of Yahweh and removing idolatry. Right? It was not completely successful. Thus being the case, it was difficult to harmonize these statements with the second date given. So fine. So Zephaniah is prophesying. I'm not going to discuss so much about the date. You can look at that. Let's look at the author. What is his name means? It simply means either sheltered. Zephaniah means sheltered or protected by Yahweh, right? So that is submit. Or there are suggestions that his name means watchman of Yahweh, right? Watchman of Yahweh. So from the superscription of Zephaniah, we read that Zephaniah was apparently a contemporary of Jeremiah and possibly also of Nahum and Habakkuk. Similar to Joel and Obadiah, the focus of Zephaniah prophecy is in the D-O-L. What is that? Day of the Lord. However, unlike Obadiah and Joel, the D-O-L or Day of the Lord in Zephaniah is universal in scope, involves Israel and the nations. So, main topic is D-O-L, Day of the Lord. So our aim in explaining this book will be mainly looking at what is Day of the Lord actually means. So, read rest of the things. Let me show you the outline. The theme is Day of the Lord, right? That is the theme, D-O-L, right? So anytime when you look at the word like D-O-L, it simply means Day of the Lord. So verse 1 is a superscription. Then you have chapter 1, verse 2 to chapter 2, verse 15 is Day of the Lord as divine judgment you have. And then going to chapter 3. So basically these 3 chapters, you have Day of the Lord as a divine deliverance. So completely this explains Day of the Lord. So let's look at the interpretive issue here. All right, that's what we want to spend time. And one issue in Zephaniah's prophecy that needs to be discussed is that of the D-O-L. The derivation of the concept is uncertain. Several have suggested that it comes from the idea prevalent in ancient Near Eastern, A&E, that a mighty warrior king could consummate an entire military campaign in a single day. That is the suggestion most of the people come up with, right? Just Day of the Lord. It is a mighty warrior king destroying an enemy combatant, and the enemy warriors just in a single day, just destroy everything together. In any case, virtually all recognize that the expression day, as used here, refers to a period of time, not a single day. So first of all, most of the people believe that in Zephaniah, not only in Zephaniah, throughout the Bible, Day of the Lord is not a single day. What in mind? Three questions needs to be answered. First, what is the character of DOL? Does it refer exclusively divine judgment? Or it also includes divine blessing? That's the first question. What is the character? How does it look like? Only judgment or includes blessing also? Second, how many such days are there? Are there many days of the Lord in the Bible? Are there many? Is the DOL solely eschatological? Do the biblical authors use the term describe historical events as well? Are there more than one day of the Lord? Like one is historical, the other one is eschatological? That's the second question. Third, when does this eschatological day of the Lord actually begin? Does it include all of the tribulation judgment? Or only those toward end of that period? So that means there are a lot of questions have to be answered to explain what is day of the Lord. First of all, let's look at answer the first question. The evidence suggests that day of the Lord begins both the judgment and blessing, because that's what Obadiah actually tells, right? Obadiah verses 15 to 16, 18 speak of divine judgment, and 17 and 19 to 21 promise divine blessing. Let's look at maybe for a second Obadiah here. How you got only one chapter. Let's look at verse 15 and 16. Can one of you please read 15 and 16 if you have taken? All right, I will read verse 15 and 16. Day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds in return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never seen. Right? Never seen. And look at verse 18 also. The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. House of Esau will be stubble, and they will set it on fire and consume it. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. Clearly judgment. But the question is it only judgment? But verse 19 to 21, if you read, you will see it also talks about blessing. People from the Negev will occupy the mountains of Esau. People from the foothills will possess the land of Philistines. They will occupy the fields of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. The company of Israelites, exiles who are in Canaan, will possess the land as far as Zarephath. The exiles from Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the towns of the Negev. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Israel, and the kingdom will be the Lord. So, it not only talks about judgment, it also talks about blessings. Yeah. So it involves blessing, that is for sure. Let's look at the next paragraph. And one objection that is raised against this interpretation, that expression day of the Lord is never used in the sections involve divine blessings. Yes. While such is the case, the conclusion should be drawn from this, that the blessing section must be excluded from the actual day of the Lord. In each instance, in the section which promises divine blessing, the phrase are found such as on that day, at that time, and the like, which can only have their antecedents as a reference to day of the Lord. You look at all these references, not one or two, I have a lot of or connects blessing. So, day of the Lord, yes, judgment is a focus. Blessing also is another focus. It is intertwined. Day of the Lord has got judgment and blessing, right? First thing. Let's go to the second one. Day of the Lord. Second question, how many days are there? This is much more difficult to answer. Roughly, there are two ways people explain two positions. Those who argue that for more than one day of the Lord, right, include a day of the Lord activities are Assyrian invasion and captivity of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. So some people think there are two day of the Lord, two time. One is historical in nature, and another one is eschatological in nature. Like historical nature, they say Assyrian invasion was called to be day of the Lord. So Assyria invaded the northern kingdom in 722 BC, right? Then Babylonian invaded in 586 BC the southern kingdom that is known as Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, right? So that also is, they say, it can be said as day of the Lord. Then you see in the Bible, tribulation period, that is eschatological, that is futuristic. It is known as day of the Lord. Then the end of the world, the eternal state, is known as day of the Lord. Like end of the millennial kingdom is known as day of the Lord. So they would say there are two different day of the Lord. One is historical, another one is eschatological. Right? That is the first argument. Right? The first way to take. Now, others argue for a single day of the Lord. One that is exclusively eschatological. Only one that is in the future. It begins with the tribulation, right? Day of the Lord begins with the tribulation, continues through the millennium, and concludes with the bringing of an eternal state in 2 Peter verse 10. So, day of the Lord is, there's a long period of history which is more than like 1,000 years of time. Now, so that is a second position. Some people think there are 2 days of the Lord. Some people think there is only one that is purely eschatological. Deciding between the two positions is not an easy task. It is true that expression is used to context what surrounding verses are addressing a nearer judgment. Like that would support the first position of 2 days of the Lord. Like one is historical, the other one is eschatological. However, this could be explained in one of 2 ways that will still allow the day of the Lord to be exclusively eschatological. Maybe we can explain in a different way to see that day of the Lord is exclusively eschatological. Now, the prophet could be telescopic events which on the surface appear to be related, but which with the later revelation are shown to be distinct. Right? A telescopical fulfillment. Prophet could have understood that 2 distinct events were in view and simply mentioned the one to illustrate a point that also are true of others. So, a solution to the tension would be to find a reference where the expression, look, listen carefully. The day of the Lord is clearly used as a past activity. If you read the Bible and see the day of the Lord as something over, if such could be found, then there would be no question whether it is referring to a near event No question whether he's referring to an eschatological one. Unfortunately, there are no such texts exist. The closest that is found in Lamentation, where similar expression, the day of the Lord's anger is employed, while the combination is used even in Zephaniah. The phrase itself is not technical term, but it must be defined as each instance according to the context. So, my point is, it should be noted in support that the second position, that if a blessing is constituent element of the day of the Lord, then none of the historical judgments include blessing. All right. So, at least in terms of how prophets have described the future blessing. As can be seen, the question is perplexing. So I think, let me say again, right? By looking at the Bible, second position is slightly preferred. That is DOL. If you really study, this is eschatological. There are no two different types of day of the Lord. There is only one, right? The expression itself is definite, presumably referring to a specific event, and appears to have a consistently eschatological focus. So I am taking day of the Lord as something that will take place in the future. It's a little difficult, but I think if maybe we can explain that every passage where it says in that day is a reference to a futuristic text. All right, now let's look at the third question. When, right, does this eschatological day of the Lord begin? That is a challenging question to answer. When it will begin? If it is eschatological, if day of the Lord is futuristic, then when it begins? While there are a number of answers has been suggested, at least we can bring out two positions. There are those who argue future day of the Lord begins at some point in the last half of the tribulation period, right? Okay. Last half of the tribulation period. Some people suggest that means not in the beginning. Others argue future day of the Lord and the tribulation begin roughly at that same time. So that means either beginning of the tribulation or end of the tribulation. That is the two positions. Now, how do we get that day of the Lord begins in tribulation? Debate revolves primarily around four passages. Number one, Joel 2:31, which we discussed, quoted in the book of Acts. Another one, 3:14, then Malachi 4:5, then plus 2 Thessalonians 2:2. Right? These are the four main passages that talks about the day of the Lord as something that takes place in the tribulation, or maybe the beginning of tribulation. Those who support the first position argue that these passages identify certain events in the tribulation period that function as the precursors of the day of the Lord. And in Malachi 4:5 is the coming of the forerunner for the Messiah is set to precede day of the Lord. Right? Forerunner in Malachi. Who is the forerunner? Think about. So he comes, and that is a precursor of the day of the Lord. In Joel 2:31 and 2 Thessalonians 2:2, it is the events at the midpoint that serve as the precursor. Especially in Joel 3:14, it is armies gathering for Armageddon at the end of the tribulation. that is to set to precede the day of the Lord. Before the day of the Lord arrives, there will be war known as Armageddon. Right? So that's how sometimes you look at it. So those who support the day of the Lord, not the beginning of the tribulation period, but they maybe midpoint or at the end, think that the day of the they take this verse as a support. Those who take second position, right, to argue to the contrary, that is day of the Lord, is the beginning point of tribulation, right? As the tribulation begins, day of the Lord begins. Those who take that argument, they say these generally equate judgment aspect of the DOL with the tribulation period itself. They believe day of the Lord means judgment. Tribulation is judgment. So easy. On the analogy of the tribulation, you have verses Matthew 24, verses 5 to 8, with the Matthew 24, verse 9 to 21, where the tribulation period is divided between the first half, called the beginning of birth of pangs, and second half, called the Great Tribulation. Let's look at that passage just to see how Matthew divides this passage. Let's look at Matthew 24 for a second. Just now, bring 40 in chapter 24. Yeah. So if you look at Matthew verses 24 verses 5, this is what you read: for many will come in my name, right? It begins from there, right? The explanation, the first part of tribulation. Many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but to see to that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. The end is still to come. The nations will rise against nations and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Then it says, verse 8 says, all these are beginning of birth of pangs or birth of pains, right? Birth of pains. Then you have verses 9 to 21 is the second half of the tribulation period. And as you read 9 onwards, you will see, and especially, can one of you read verse 15 if you have opened?
Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by David, Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand.
Yes. So the second half, clearly Matthew indicates Daniel prophecy, right? And verse 15 says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, very clear, right? Abomination that causes desolation. Now, let's go to Daniel 9:29 for a minute. Daniel 9. Remember, if you know chapter 9, Daniel chapter 9 talks about 70 weeks, right? 70 weeks. And if you look at verse 1, all right. '27. Daniel 9:27. Can one of you please read? Okay.
And
Go
he
ahead.
will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations will be one who creates the desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on the desolator.
All right. So in Daniel, it is very clear that he makes a covenant for 1 week, which is equivalent to 7 years. 1 week is equal to 7 years. And in the middle of that 7, or in the middle of that 1 week, or in the middle of that 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. So it is in the second half. So if you look at Matthew 24, it is very right. It is very clear. All right, very clear that when Matthew 24 talks about two aspects of tribulation period, the first half and the second half. So maybe the first half is, Matthew would say, beginning of birth of pangs. And the second half will be, Matthew would say, the time of great tribulation. So the judgment portion of the DOL is divided into 2 halves. The first half referred to by symbol expression, the day of the Lord, and second half is referred to as the great terrible day of the Lord. Assuming this is the case, Joel 2:31 and Malachi 4:5 are both describing events that are to take place before the great terrible day of the Lord. That is, events that will happen before the last half of the judgment portion. Not before the day of the Lord per se, but before the great day of the Lord. Furthermore, Joel 3:14 is simply describing the fact that God's judgment of the nations in Armageddon is near, or it is impending. And if you look at Thessalonians chapter 2, you see it is interpreted as the defection or apostasy of professing Christendom and the revelation of the Antichrist, both of which will take place at the outset of the tribulation. According to Thessalonians, day of the Lord, and it is just the outset of the tribulation period. 7 weeks is known, like the 70th week or 7 years is known as day of the Lord. So that means 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 2 appears to support the second position, right? That is, day of the Lord is the entire tribulation period. There are times, sometimes it talks about the end, sometimes it talks about the entire tribulation period, and sometimes day of the Lord will indicate events that will take place at the end of millennial kingdom event, which tells that it is a longer period, not shorter, but definitely it includes tribulation period, right? Includes the entire tribulation period. All right, so I would say identification of the judgment aspect of the day of the Lord with the tribulation is consistent with the description in the scripture. So if you ask the question, what is the day of the Lord? It's a period of time begins with the tribulation, right? It goes all the way, even it includes 1,000 years, even it includes white throne judgment that takes place at the end of millennial kingdom, right? It's not single day, it is a long period where it describes judgment plus blessing. Both are there. A judgment for Jewish people, a judgment and a blessing for Jewish people, a judgment for Gentiles and a blessing for Gentiles. So, day of the Lord is not a single day. If you take all the verses that's referred to day of the Lord together, what you get is a longer period that will take place in the future. It is eschatological in nature.